Between the time when chaos broke Cadia and the return of the sons of the Emperor, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Kronan, wearer of the jeweled crown of Aquilonia, upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure.
And so it was that we rejoin our hero, Kronan, big boss of the cunning Waaagh. And today, he had really earned not just his name, but the adoration of the entire Waaagh, the sum totality of his people, the Greenskins. For today was the day that he would close his fist around the neck of that prancing dandy dipstick, Yanes Blonde, the Smeldar pirate prince. Oh yes, he would. He could practically taste it. Not to say that he knew the taste of Smeldar or anything, for there was some reticence to consume these jumped-up jackasses. None could really put their finger on why it was considered so uncouth to snaffle the Smeldar, but nor did any question it either. So Kronan did not know the succulence of the Smeldar, but the point stands. Grinning from ear to ear, Kronan watched as the enemy flagship got bigger and bigger as he powered towards it. The darkness of the void was lit like a nightclub at the height of disco, with lances and missiles flashing across the skies. Each light was a discharge of planet-melting energy, each missile larger than a motorhome, as the stair fleets tore each other new ones, as many as possible as they duked it out. The pure, unadulterated joy of it all. The pandemonium Kronan had unleashed was of a scale and grandeur he could scarcely believe. It brought a tear to his eye that so much carnage was being unleashed at his merest whim. But that, of course, was hardly the correct descriptor, for none of this had been easy. None of this had been simple, and none of this had been done on a whim. This entire event was proof of the efficacy and lethality of the invocation of the dark powers of Kronan. It was the culmination of weeks of meticulous orky activity. Well, enthusiastic might probably be a better word to use, but it is purely to dramatically reflect that this had been a Herculean task, which is sort of apt, as old Heracles was never known for his considered wit or wisdom, but amply endowed in divinely engorged power. Hence, I should definitely use it more often as an adjective, as it seems to be incredibly appropriate for the tales of high adventure. Anywho, Yanes Blonde had fallen into Kronan's trap. Oh yes, he had. Now was the time for the coup de grace, which is just a foppish French way of saying that you were going to put someone or something out of its misery. But even that was not particularly accurate, as we shall see. For Kronan was to declare his levelling up, to show his upgrades, to demonstrate that he was indeed not just an initiate or neophyte of the arts. No. When he began this story, he was but the learner. Now, he truly was the master. But this must be all very confusing, so let us get back to where we left off, for now we know that there is something juicy coming up at the end of the chapter. And so it was. The Ducker von Smashhoven had finally dealt with that rapscallion, the Deathbird, the cast-iron bast. Mano y mano, von Smashhoven had outthought and outfought the Smeldar ace, torn off his wings, and then shot him down, enriching Ducker's name to the collected memory of the entire Waaagh. It was a feat that had been weeks in the making. The elan of the fleet bounced back like a baseball made of flubber after being hit by the Hulk. The raucous celebrations went on for days. Days in which nary a single Smeldar sheep could be made hide nor hair of. They were hiding. Or, more likely, they were rocking back and forth while weeping and howling at the loss of their hero, the Deathbird. But, in truth, the Smeldar were also gnashing at the bit for a healthy dollop of payback. And this is the way of Waaagh. For the Smeldar did not see that the death of the cast-iron Bast had been payback for the execution of so many good Orky flyboys. Yet they wished for payback on the person given for payback, which meant that they would not admit that this had been totally fair and square. And if they took payback for payback, then surely the greenskins would match them and require even more payback. Like fractional reserve banking, it was a cycle that could only end in utter misery and destruction. The cycle of strife continued. And it had to until either the Orcs or the Smeldar were all dead. Or so many would usually believe. Ha! But this is not a tale of low or even mid-adventure, but of high adventure. Hence, listen on and we shall get to the best bits later. Honestly, you'll love it. And so it was that Kronan now put into place his grand stratagem. Having checked and rechecked his logs and sticks, arranged everything as he needed, bullied, bawled and bashed until he was semi-convinced that the grot lickers amongst his command staff were actually on the same page. Well, more likely the same book, which was about all he could hope for really. But in any case, he had cogitated long and knew what he had to do. So he did it. And that would mean a delay of a week or so, as elements of the fleets took up position. Of course, Grand Mouth Tartan was overseeing all of this, because it was boring to the Cunning One, and Grok's work was for the underbosses and admirals. So, this left Kronan with a period where he would not only have to create his own entertainment, but said entertainment would also have to maintain the forward momentum of the Waaagh. He was asking them to be that most difficult P-word of all to even consider for the greenskins. Patience. And when one takes such a toll on the heart of his boys, well, one must also give. It was the rule of the ruler, the duty of the king. He would have to put on some circuses. And Kronan was immediately assailed with a phenomenally excellent plan. For it was only yesterday that he had witnessed the odd and hilarious repercussions of a simple diktat. For all knew that Kronan had missed old Gitsquisher McMurder. Not that oddie Hackbar, the admiral of the Forerunner fleet, but Gitsquisher had been a real blow to lose. For he was so very good at keeping Kronan chipper. Whenever things got too tedious, he and Kronan had often gone on a bit of a rampage. I mean, not a real one, as that would be incredibly hard to justify and near impossible to hide, even with the mystery of truth helping out with less than savoury events. But the two of them were positively gargantuan, and unquestionably the most meaty and fighty in all of the Waaagh. Oh, Nogcrusher often went about stating he was harder than McMurder, but nobody believed him, not really. Hence, when Kronan had become bored or a bit snappy, Gitsquisher often invited him to a game of grot ball. Now this was a simple but very fun pastime. It involved a grot, of course it did, and about 10 of their beefiest bodyguard types, and a lot of blood. They would line up facing one another, and then a grot would be given to one side or the other, who would then need to rush past their opposing side and put the grot in the net at the end of the field. It was small and raised, so it was not always as easy as one might think. Plus, many a grot had become squished when shot too enthusiastically at the wall or board around the hoop-like net. And of course, none were permitted weapons. Well, officially, but definitely no ducker was allowed in any of these grot ball games. Why ball, one might ask? Well, the hoop net was very small, and crushing the grot into a ball usually made it far easier to get them through this net. In any case, the carnage would be instant, as the teams would pull each other apart getting to the grot. And McMurder and Kronan really enjoyed wading through their teams into the opposition. Many a time had Kronan given McMurder the kind of thrashing that would make most lose their stomach contests across the floor. But Gitsquisher was a hardy orc, and his self-healing abilities were second only to Kronan. Now some had wondered if they should not be calling this particular sport Blood Bowl instead. And somewhere in the multiverse, Nuffle awoke. But this was laughed off by both Kronan and Gitsquisher as patently daft. The blood was always just a side product of the real event, the acquisition of the grot. So Grot Ball it remained. Yet, with Gitsquish and McMurder away, he had found some events so tedious that Kronan had invoked the rule of 3 so much that said meetings had become rare indeed. Although this was almost blissful for about a day, Kronan realized with a sinking flop that he was actually neglecting his people. For they had discussions before when needed, so his increased rejection of the cries for wisdom, cunning and leadership was not a proper sacrament to his god, Mork. But how to make things slightly less tedious had always been the goal, and it happened all on its own. For at the end of one particularly long and grating meeting, Kronan had waffled on about McMurder's lack of a pet. It showed a lack of character, stated Kronan, now a bit bitter towards his friend McMurder out of pure loneliness really. Kronan had gone on and on about it. Hence, yesterday, he was awed, for he was expecting another congregation of chaps that would bore him endlessly, and he simply wasn't up for it today. He was already stretching and warming up for the kicking he was about to dish out when the bosses all processed into the huge tent-adorned bay. For Kronan had this place altered so it looked like the interior of a tent, as had been the Orky way on Orquilonia for ages past. It made him feel more at home and reminded his bosses and boys of their roots. And Kronan's eyes widened, and his lips curled into a massive, cheery grin, for he witnessed a pageant the like had never been witnessed before. For the Moor Naval had visited all of the highest-ranking bosses and discussed with them how to raise Kronan's spirits. Hence, they had come to one hilarious conclusion. They would fulfill the wishes of their lord. Yes, they would. And so it was that each of the bosses walked in as usual, but this time they all had something with them. A pet. Kronan beamed at each as they took up their places and then sat. As he went around the table, each one stood and introduced their pet. Daka von Smashoven sat at the cunning one's side with the rest of the existing Moor Naval, extended his gloved hand and showed off a spectacular beast. For he had on his arm a squighawk, who he introduced as Squawk von Smashoven. Isaac Newtone was next, placing his pet on the table before him. It was a robo-grot he called Roland. Madnut Krunkelstein took out a rather weedy but exceptionally cute squig, which he called Erebus. Now Gitsquisher was not present, so Hypocrates had temporarily been elevated to the Moor Naval, Kronan's inner concilium, and he brought out a particularly engorged and mutated squig with incredibly sharp teeth. It was certainly not the size of Tiddles, but it had throbbing veins and corded muscles, and looked like it was wearing more eyeliner than a goth kid in high summer. It was a vampire squig. Yet all knew this pet, Vlad von Vroomstein, had been supping on the oddest concoctions Hypocrates could concoct. Hence, anything could be happening within that blood-sucking ball of hate. Now Hakmar was not present, but he was not missed either, and the only other admiral about was, of course, Grandmouth Tartan. Tartan had brought a clear glass bowl of water. What swam inside were a shoal of rippy fish he had dubbed the Hunger. Then it went on to the lesser bosses. Grinner the Backstabber had a cyber squig parrot he called Laserbeak. Melton John had a strangely painted grox. None could understand it until he gave its name. It was Gareth the Golden Grox. Now Bub von Butch had originally wanted to use Henrietta, his hair squig moustache, as his pet, but everyone had groaned and told him this was minimum effort and unlikely to endear him to the cunning one. Hence, instead, Bob von Butch brought his secondary pet, ever-popular Patsy, the Ambul. Hiawafter was an easy one, as he simply brought in Munchington III, his Squigosaurus. Step-on Squawking had a strange lizard thing that changed colour. It stood like an orc, but was about as small as a grot. He called it Stink the Skink, and he was right. It was a rather odd, pongy thing. All but Eye-Sting then brought out his own thing, and many looked on in confusion, for he introduced Mr. Drofo, his tiny humie. It was a runtling, or something like that, but it seemed extraordinarily heavily armed for a pet. It had darker and armour, and a weird glint in its eye. None derided it, but none took a shine to it either. Now there came the minimum effort slackers, or outright morons. It was hard to tell with these two. For Colonel Stinker had brought Flynn the Favoured, which was his favourite crack grenade. An Appledon, or Nog Smasher, the head of the Black Legion, brought along Rocky, which was, uninspiringly enough, a rock. Not a pebble or boulder, it was definitely a rock. In fact, many later commented that although Appledon was indeed as dense as that which he was mastered over, Rocky was the most rock-like thing they had ever seen. Go figure. There had only been one pet that the Moor Naval had outright banned, and this was the assistant of Chains Grond, Orc of Mystery. For big-eared Penny, his humie slave, which of course he called an assistant, was not well liked. For it swore a lot, and I mean a lot. Usually that might be slightly irritating to many humies, coming from someone so well, endowed. But she knew absolutely no limits. Her foulness made even the greenskins blanch. Hence, she was disqualified, and Chains Grond refused to attend in protest, as he pointed out that Mr. Drofo was far more dangerous than Penny ever could be. Yet, as one would expect, he was utterly overruled, and nearly had his head exploded by Madnut, but Ducker talked him out of it. One Smashover knew the uses of Chains Grond, even if Madnut did not. So he talked him down by placing his boot into Madnut's rump repeatedly, until they had left the temporary dwelling place of the Orc of Mystery. And Kronan was enthralled, as others now kicked off the meeting and went through things as quickly as possible. Kronan watched the interactions between the differing pets and what hilarity it caused. Ensorcelled, Kronan could not get enough. Alas, this meant that he kept calling meetings over the next day. It got to the extent he would add even more points to the itinerary, just as one meeting would wrap up in a blatant attempt to elongate matters. For each meeting was now raucous, as none of the pets were particularly well trained nor obedient, and their close proximity to one another would cause obvious conflicts that would then escalate, so their owners would mimic the interactions of their pets. Re, when one pet accosted another, the owners were almost instantly dragged into the fray. To lose one's pet was one thing, to eat one's pet another. But to have someone else's pet eat their pet? An affront that no truly orky orc could allow to stand without answer. Now, most got into at least some barging, apart from the oddities. Patsy the Amble was avoided by all but Munchington, and they eyed each other up along with Tiddles. But both knew, on an intrinsic level, that the avatar of Teeth was a big boy on the block. It was Erebus that was left alone by all. Perhaps it was his cuteness. Perhaps he was just not seen as a threat. But none interfered with Erebus the Squig. When Gareth the Grox near stepped on him, the little ball merely looked up at the huge lizard, and it backed off in seeming terror. Deeply odd. Yet things were now getting counterproductive, for Kronan had set all in motion and was literally hanging about to kill time. But his underbosses had been given tasks, and the cunning one would expect results no matter what. So again, they were in a conundrum. Not that anyone would have put it that way, but the truth is as it is. Hence, Darker von Smashoven, ever showing he was the most ardent and able student of cunning, devised a plan of his own. The bosses needed to entertain Kronan, but also needed to get things done. So, somehow, they would need to perform some form of relay race or tag team event, where they all took it in turns to erupt the big boss for a time. And he hit on it. A pet show. This would not only entertain the Lord of the Cunning Waaagh, but was bound to provide endless mirth to the entire fleet and every greenskin on it. A win to be certain. All they had to do was come up with tests that would best reflect the spirit of their sidekicks. It was noted that Rocky and Flynn the Favoured were unlikely to get many points, but they proceeded anyways. For it was known that there was no true way to be fair with such an eclectic congregation of oddies. But they would try. When Kronan was called upon to judge the contestants of the morrow, he was elated. He retired early and took out his data slate, just to check things again before he entered the land of Nod. What a good day he would have tomorrow. So he made sure he would have no fleeting, nagging, bugging concerns to distract him. So he perused the plan yet again. And it was a total work of arse, as the Humies said. Now Kronan had identified his 3 issues previously. 1. The Waaagh needed a massive victory against the Smeldar. A massive one. Yes, the defeat of the cast iron Bast was a good morale-raising event, but it was not a set-piece fleet action, more a sideline than anything. Issue 2. He did not have the time to devote to hunting down and sinking every sheep and slaying every Smeldar. If he took time out to do this, with the Smeldar ability to scarper and bugger off as it was, his Waaagh would fall apart under the weight of inertia. And issue 3. He had an empire now. If he simply cruised past the Smeldar region and left them alive, they could cripple his supply lines and raid the living heck out of his practically defenseless backfield holdings. An enigma to be certain, but one he now felt he had cracked, and in the most cunning way possible. A legendary feat that would be worthy of inclusion in the annals of the Greenskins. Not since a war in Devon had there been such a cunning move. Now, all he had to do was pull it off. Now, not in a handle-tugging Humie way, but in a good Greenskin Orky way, of course. And so, he perused his steps to the slaughter, his incredible plan. He would need to negate the ability of the Smeldar to scarper, and this was no mean feat at all. He would need to negate the advantage given by their fartseers. Prophetic power was always slanted towards the pointies after all. But perhaps, just perhaps, he had what it took to even those odds, now that he knew the secrets of a certain headgear that one of his bosses wore. He would need to negate the Smeldar's reluctance to actually come out and fight, and their main instinct seemed to be to bugger off as soon as anyone turned up who might give them a real fight. Unsurprising in many ways, for the Smeldar were known for being tricksy. Yet, when they were forced, or even chose to, their ability to scrap in the void was second to none. And crumbs had Kronan lost a lot of sheeps to these scallywags. The list went on and on. The bloated boar, the rampaging wretch, the sordid slaughter, the rugged rock, the vengeful sprite, the green one, the last charge, the burning breeches, the bestest ever. All battle sheeps of gargantuan power, or sunk in the last 2 months as the battle drew on. And the list of crippled battleships was also horrific. The Captain Pugwash, the brutal bugger, the Crimson Crucifier, the blatant disregard for safety regulations, the burning bushes, the vicious velocity, and the extermipotimus, all had seen better days and been left at conquered worlds for repairs. Even the Mork Rampant, previously known as a running for cover, had to be sent to dry dock for a complete overhaul. The list of sunk kill cruisers and escorts mounted to an eye-watering degree. Over 80 sheeps of the line had been annihilated by this time, although more floatiders joined the Waaagh practically every day still. Appledon now being in charge of first contact rituals, the losses were stacking up a little too fast for Kronan's liking. He had indeed improved in his lordship of the sheep of the line, and Tartan had come on in leaps and bounds, yet they were still not actually winning enough matchups. Of course, when the Smeldar bases were located, and they put up token forces to defend them, the carnage was truly life-affirming, and Rawingi was in rich supply. But this was not nearly often enough, and Kronan had gone through more dangerous episodes of deep cogitation to attempt to deal with the issue. He had built on the revelations of each session, always maintaining the use of Phyllis, the head-thinking grot, for after cogitation, what he now called understanding sessions. For thinking was dangerous enough. He had to make sure he did not miss out on any of his lightning bolts of understanding. Hence, he had worked his brain more than he had worked his body of late. Yet, it was also going to be worth it. Ah, yes, it was. For Kronan now spread his fleets out. He had been studying the Primpimpia Bellitosta, as we have heard, and he put some of his new knowledge to the test. The cunning one would create a huge net, as was described under an entry that mentioned a great Hume admiral, Pompey the Great, how he had swept the seas of pirates and their ilk on Terra, whenever that was. Hence, Kronan had his blueprint. Over the next weeks, his ships would get into position, then begin to constrict. He knew that there were 10 good Orky ships for every one of the Smeldar, and this shrinking noose would force them to either engage in strength to attempt to break out of the encirclement, or they would retreat again and again until they had nowhere left to go, and nothing they could do but accept a massive Barney to decide the matter. Kronan knew that either way the Smeldar prince, Yanes Blonde, would be in a stick, for he knew that if he retreated from this region, the Greenskins would destroy every last base station, hidey hole and port he had used for centuries. And it would not sit right with such a proud being to simply roll over and accept their eviction from the stars. No. If Kronan knew anything about this princeling, it was that he was an egotist. And he would not give up without a glorious fight. Kronan only had to get him to decide exactly where he would wage this main battle. And then he would close the trap and deal with things as he always knew he should have, up close and personal. No buts, no glory hole, as Kronan believed a human said. In any case, it was going to be a doozy. All things in place, all things prepared, checked and double-checked, Kronan now reclined to rest his head. Of course, he was interrupted by the squealing of Phyllis as he leaned backwards onto the grot, but managed to counteract his downward movement and raise suitably for wee Phyllis to escape and trot back to the grot blocks set aside for the chosen ones, the thinking grots of Kronan. That out of the way, Kronan slipped into a deep and restful sleep, giggling as he attempted to predict the hijinks of the morrow. Now Kronan had a weird night, if we can be honest, which we always attempt to be in the Chronicles. For he was awoken in a very odd way. Kronan heard movement in his inner sanctum, but he did not move himself. He merely half opened one eye. He did not know what he expected at this point. Perhaps a minion of Bastor or Toba, or even she who thrusts, sent to hack off his head during the night? Or maybe someone else. For all knew how truly bow-liquefyingly terrifying a Waaargh in full swing could be. Needless to say, he had even considered that colossal pervert, the Hume Goddy Emperor, might have sent an assassin to do the job. But then, how on Orquilonia would said thug get into his personal quarters? So, Kronan was somewhat relieved, and equally disappointed really, that a scrap was not in the offing. For he could now clearly see 2 forms moving around his room, well, added to the grots that always moved around on his ceiling, in his grot aerial mobile, as I have related before. One of them was a huge ball of spite, which could only be Tiddles, and he crooned softly at the smaller thing that was wandering about the place with some form of muggins in tow. A small thing, orky enough by the whiff, so this had to be Tiddles' pet, Happy Len, who had, as instructed, gained his own pet, a snot called Arthur, who had in turn got his own pet as well, the mouth squig, Bernard. Of course, Kronan was shown all of these things yesterday, when Tiddles wandered up to him and opened his maw wide to permit Kronan to see Happy Len holding Arthur, who was holding Bernard. It was like a deeply twisted nesting dolls arrangement that made Kronan laugh until he shat, which is no mean feat, even for someone as avuncular and generally jolly as the cunning one. And so it was that Kronan espied these 2 familiar friends wandering about in his room. He could not help it. He had to know. Kronan had to know. as the two wandered off into some huge sliding door that Kronan was never aware of previously. There was just enough time for him to roll up and then through the door as it closed, the two conspirators marching off down the back alleys of the sheep. They did not notice him, which was quite a feat. But then, Happy Len was humming one of his jaunty ditties as Tiddles chomped his teeth together to the tune, adding an amazing level of depth to the entire affair, as it seemed to go perfectly with their footsteps, creating this strangely beautiful arrangement. Long did Kronan wonder, as they went back into the lights of the normal thoroughfares through the sheep, and Kronan could see some form of box, with a long corrugated, drooping thing coming out of it, a bit like a Hume handle, but with a flat area at its terminus. And he recalled how he had awoken. It was not just a movement. It was a loud rumble that came from this box. And so it was. The Kronan did stalk them back into the region he had witnessed Tiddles being paid homage, as I mentioned last episode. But they did not stop there. The two wandered down even further, to a dark, dank region, deep in the bowels of the sheep. Kronan watched in awe as they all got to a huge hall that was covered in mushrooms and other fungi, and there, in the middle, was a deep and wide patch of soil, and out of the soil would burst small orcoids on the regular. Kronan now watched as Happy Len then took the box and unattached the long thing, took off its lid, and emptied the contents onto the soil. Happy Len and Tiddles then stomped on the spores and dust that came from the box, mixing it deep within the earth. Now Len and Tiddles began to walk around, picking up the small orcoid youths and checking them. When they had finished scrutinizing the being, they did one of two things. Either Len would shake his head dolefully and then lob the tiny green orcoid into Tiddles' mouth, which he quickly snaffled, of course, or even stranger, they would both beam at one another, looking at the cradled orcoid youth with real affection, then place it in the next room. Now Kronan could not see into the next room without revealing himself, and he would never know why, but again, like when he discovered the cult of the Avatar of Teeth, Kronan backed away slowly. He did not want to be involved in whatever this was. He was about to turn to leave when he saw one slightly older, larger orcoid come out of the other room. Clearly running away from Len, the wee grot chased after the youth and dived on it. But then he did not beat the youth. He tickled it and incapacitated it with laughter, still doing so while Len then picked up the youth and drew it back into the other room. And Kronan saw the face of the wee orcoid. It was certainly no grot, snort, or squig. One day it would be an orc. It is all in the cranium-to-body ratio, don't you know? And Kronan felt an odd feeling as he looked upon the face of the orc. It was so familiar, but he could not put his finger on who or what the youth reminded him of. By the raucous sound now coming from the other room, it was feeding time, as Kronan heard the unmistakable sound of Tiddles doing one of his thunder chunders. A banquet indeed for such widow orkies. But how many of these youths were in the strange nursery? Kronan decided it was all a dream, as he refused to punch or pinch himself, and backed out of the nursery and trudged back to his bed. The looks on the Legion's faces as he wandered past them, when none remembered him coming out, would have been highly amusing to the cunning one, if he were not in such a daze. He knew that little face. He did. Perhaps it would come to him during the pet games tomorrow. No matter, thought Kronan. With Tiddles and Happy Len involved, whatever it was that they were up to, surely it could only be to his advantage. And Kronan drifted off to sleep, the sleep of the just. And so it was that the morn came and the event began. Now each big boss had obviously been a part of the procession. All was displayed by the mystery of truth, so that the entire Waaagh could enjoy the proceedings. And what a sight to see it was! For each of the pets had been decked out in their best finery, and the bosses had hardly scrimped either. Each was positively dripping with muggins, gubbins, strutty stuff, and shiny bits. All wore their finest Penelope of war, and as much booty as they could fit on themselves. Which, seeing as these were the bosses of the Waaagh, was not inconsiderable. seeing as so many of the points of the contest were distributed oddly. One of the places where these elusive scoring points could be accrued was in the first of the contest, and this was who looks more like their pet. Obviously, Kronan was to be the head judge in all of this, but a good percent of the marks for each contestant in each category would be decided by the howls of joy from the audience and the other sheeps of the Waaagh. For Kronan would ask for the reports from each of the main capital battle sheeps, and the volume of their shout would decide the amount of favour their votes would gain. Not that it was that scientific or numerically fastidious in its decision, but Kronan would at least take it into consideration before giving out the winning ribbons. As Kronan's favourite number was so esoteric, well, mainly because most greenskins could not get that far, but in any case, it was a magical number. Hence, only the very top 3 pet and owner combinations would gain points in any given round. Simple and effective, yet technical enough to shut out the majority of the viewership, as it has always been in such events. And so it was that the bosses paraded and Kronan deliberated. Now technically, he had 2 runt herds with him to advise on his deliberations, yet Kronan could not for the life of him remember their names, nor did he inquire, for there was only one runt herd that would ever truly matter to him, and now he was long gone. And considering that there were already over a dozen named central characters in the tale, I did not wish to overburden you with more inconsequential and one-off appearing names. Moving on. And so it was that the winners became pretty obvious right off the bat, for Docker and Squawk von Smashhoven had exactly the same expression on their faces the entire time. And the hooked nose of Squawk was the abject spitting image of Docker, the winner seeming to be right there. Yet, he did not take it. I mean, most of them were utterly ridiculous. Melton John and his grox, Gareth, were as different as 2 beings could possibly get. And Bub von Butch did try to pose like his Amble did, but even so, the similarity was fleeting even with this in play. Izap and Roland the Robo-Grot did no better, and Grinner and Laserbeak made a striking sight, but they were not exactly similar, even by Orky standards. The runaway surprise had to be Appledon, who most called Nog Smasher, for he had taken the time to paint himself grey and rock-like in both shade and pattern, and oddly enough, it was undeniable that he was the second most like his pet, Rocky. But the real kerfuffle kicked off when Mad Nut Krunkelstein and his pet, Erebus, did a wee dance routine. Obviously, it was a devotional stamping affair that was highly ritualized, which was no surprise coming from the head weird boy of the Waaagh. But when Krunkelstein and Erebus ended their last stomps, then both their eyes lit up with green energies, and they simultaneously lifted off the floor. It was a shoo-in for victory. For all now knew that Erebus was no normal orcoid, no normal squig. He was, in fact, an incredibly powerful, weird squig. The crowd went absolutely loopy at this last display, and even Kronan was found to clap at its end. So Madnut had come in first, Appledon in second, and Docker in third. So Madnut and Docker had swiped 2 of the 3 available positions early, the more naval, proving their dominance in all things, of course. There was only one hiccup, as Grandmouth Tartan asked for a recount. He honestly and totally believed that his pet looked far more like him than anyone else here, and not by some small measure. Alas, Kronan did not agree. In a move of utter genius, he then introduced Tartan to his pets by taking Tartan's hand and wrestling it into the bowl. Predictably, there was a lot of blood exploding out of the bowl, as the Rippyfish really went to town. But Tartan took it like a champ, and just glared at the cunning one as this went on. He only needed his mouth, really, thought Kronan, and it seemed this feeling was reflected in the exuberance by the onlooking crowds. Yet, it was all necessary to make sure that there would be no more quibbling over the calls of the cunning one, and thus things moved swiftly on. Now the obedience test was a strange and incredibly difficult event as well. for it meant that the pet would be presented with the best treats possible, then be ordered to not eat them until their masters had given it permission. Now this round was very hotly contested. Not that we can say that for the majority of the participants, but for the frontrunners, it was close. I mean, there was zero chance that Bub von Butch was going to gain anything like obedience out of Patsy, his amble, for he had been ordered to stop giving it mushrooms before the event, so to replace this, it was usually being controlled by a strong chain attached to its neck and limbs and held by von Butch. Alas, when presented with some snots to eat, Bub von Butch was just dragged around the arena as the amble chased after the scrambling snots. And it did take a minute, actually, as the snots were way faster than the amble. Yet its endurance won out, and it squashed the snots and licked their viscera off its claws when they had simply no more energy to run away. Higher Wafter was considered to be a bit of a ringer in this event, yet Munchington III was amply and appropriately named, as he went berserk and wolfed down the snots he was presented in less time than it takes a GP to prescribe statins. Now Gareth the Golden had seemed like he would be an absolute titan in this field, for he refused to even look at the tasty hay the Grots had bought for its test. Alas, when Melton John gave it permission to eat, the doe-eyed moronic beast simply stared at him. Thus, Gareth was disqualified, as he had nothing to obey or resist in this particular test. And Kronan did send his commiserations to old Melton, but rules were rules. And Roland the Robo-Grot did no better, for he glitched and had to be dragged off to be recharged. Hence, he also was disqualified. Now Stinker and Appledon were also disqualified on this round, for neither Rocky nor Flynn the favoured crack grenade really had a horse in the race. So again, they had to forego the chance at any points whatsoever. The others came and went, but it was the last three that gave real difficulties all around. For Squawk von Smashhoven, again, was indeed well trained. And all but Eye-Sting's runtling, Mr. Drofo, just calmly took out his eating bib, knife and fork, and waited like a statue until informed he could tuck into the pie before him. It was impressive. Yet the weirdest thing was the clear winner, for again, it was Erebus. He watched the snots without moving, eyeing up Mad Nut Krunkelstein for his mark, yet, when given it, the snots instantly exploded. Erebus powered over and opened its mouth, and the bits dropped into its maw. On control, power and sheer panache, Erebus had taken its second gold medal of the day. Yet, things had begun to brew in the background. For Kronan was watching all of this live, of course, so he missed what the greater Waaagh had been seeing. For Vid Grotz had been watching behind the scenes and giving extra info to the punters. Hence, did the Waaagh spot when Erebus had previously locked eyes on Gareth, and both their sets of eyes had flashed. It was also when Erebus watched Vlad von Vroomstein, resisting his urges to chase after the snots, that one of them had bounced into the air and slammed down so hard that they had practically burst. Kronan did not spot the green lambent light that illuminated the snot before it bounced, but others did. The fresh blood filled the nostrils of Vroomstein, and he had been off. Nothing Hippocrates could do would stop him, and the Waaagh had seen this. So when the votes for the viewers came in, Kronan was shocked. He wanted to give Erebus first place, for the slaughter had been so fast, effective, and deeply amusing, yet the shouts for him were not exactly what he had expected to hear. For they did not all just cheer or boo. They exclaimed, "Cluck, Erebus," or something like that. Hence, the weird squig and its crestfallen master Madnut were only given second place this time. Still ahead of Ducker and Squawk, but only by a nose. So Mr. Drofo gained first place. He did not seem concerned nor elated, the ungrateful wee wretch. And speed was to be the next challenge. Now some contestants you would think would get disqualified instantly, but this was not the case. For all seemed more than capable of putting on the speed when required, although perhaps not always in the way one might imagine. Clearly, this did not apply to the Rippy Fish of Tartan yet again. His face was as long as one of those incredibly rare subhumans of the equines, horse-faced buggers who had very little to be cheery about, as they were often burnt at the stake for their lack of comeliness. Shumis were odd indeed. Anywho, there was one other immediate disqualification, but Kronan did allow the spectacle to occur, because it just seemed like a scrumptious laugh, really. For Bub von Butch wished to encourage Patsy the Amble by attaching its metal chains to the back of his megabike and firing off at his top speed. Alas, Bub von Butch was not known for his cunning, or his smarts, and when he let fly with his throttle and pulled off, the Amble did not budge an inch. When the chains became fully taut, the inevitable happened, and Bub von Butch slammed over the handlebars and sailed through the air so high that he landed in the lap of Kronan. Well, he did for about 1 second, as Kronan then helpfully returned him to the sands of the spectacle with one of his most friendly uppercuts. When Bub woke up 4 hours later, he was not surprised in the slightest that he and Patsy had missed out on the top spots this time round. The diminutive Mr. Drovo, Colin the Stink, Roland the Robogrot, and Vlad von Vroomstein made laughable attempts compared to the high flyers. Now one might think that this would be a straight-up match between Squawk von Smashhoven and Laserbeak, yet there were some real ringers, and the event became far more exciting than anyone could have guessed possible. And the carnage, it was terrible. For indeed, Squawk von Smashhoven took off at an amazing swiftness, easily beating Laserbeak on the takeoff. But there were others involved as well, for it was all simultaneously done, with the exception of Bub von Butch, despite me running off the list of slowpokes. And many were agog at the secret skills now on display. Okay, when Appledon picked up Rocky and hurled it, many were concerned, but in the end, Rocky was not particularly aerodynamic, and the race distance was a tad more than old Appledon thought. So Rocky barely made it halfway before landing and rolling to a stop. But the real treat was the others. For Munchington III was a humongous beast, and he took off at a pace few could warrant possible. Now there were some signs of frothing at the mouth, but all considered this just excitement for the event, not the half-ton of combat stims that Higher Wafter had thrust down his gob like a parent attempting to stop their brat from talking through an amazing and expensive cinema experience by getting them to stuff their faces with sweeties and popcorn instead. Yet there were no real doping rules set out for this first pet performance, so none even raised an eyebrow at that. They did, but not at Munchington's prodigious speed. Yet there were 3 more contestants to catalogue and describe, and this is where the juice really came from. For Erebus was somehow using his green wibbly-wobbly powers to rise above the ground and shot himself, much like a cannonball, towards the other side of the arena. He outpaced even Munchington III, and even came close to the frontrunners. And there, right in front of him, were the next 2. Well, one initially, for Gareth the Grox had made some form of life decisions while in between bouts, and it seemed that whatever pep talk that Melton had given to his beloved Grox was working a treat. The thing went from docile chomping to an explosion of rage and thundering stampeding down the course. He even had to dodge the vile cheating of Munchington, who tried to take a swipe of his flanks. But Gareth ran on unperturbed, as the swipe had taken the Squigosaurus slightly off its stride, and thus slowed it down. Yet it was Flynn the favoured that now came up the field like a champ. For Colonel Stinker had fumbled with his grenade launcher on the firing of the initial starter Dakar. Now, he brought it up to his shoulder and squeezed the trigger with glee. And Flynn moved towards the end line at easily the nippiest in the race. Yet a foulness was to occur. For Flynn seemed to decide that he was no longer willing to win this particular event for his master, Stinker. As Flynn sailed past Erebus, he subtly changed direction. Again, the infamy of it, for it was now clear that the Colonel had done absolutely no training with his pet, and that he had zero knowledge of the mindset of his crack grenade. For Flynn now gave off a great green light and dove up the bottom of Gareth, and, to the horror of all, he self-deleted by pulling out his own pin. Hence, Gareth and Flynn exploded with a colossal boom, and a spray of viscera that covered the entire course. All stood or sat aghast for a moment from the sheer shock, then gave the two an amazing send-off by laughing until some of them bled. And so it was that it ended as being Squawk von Smashoven in first place, Munchington in second, and Erebus in third. Now many believed that Laserbeak was taking it a little easy. Half-time commentary had also noticed that Laserbeak was never in eyeshot of Erebus in any part of the race, and vids even showed him hovering just behind the detestable Weird Squig throughout most of it. But then, he was the pet of Grinner the Backstabber. What else could one expect than for him to half-arse the event, and only do the bare minimum to save his own skin? Go figure. Alas, it now seemed that Patsy had buggered off for a wander-about on the ship, and from that point on, Bub von Butch was absent, but hardly any even noticed until the next stage was declared. It was strangely just after the announcement that Grinner reported that he had some issues on his warship and had to deal with them. And of course, this would mean that Laserbeak would not have a suitable master to support him, so he too would withdraw from the competition. Melton John was inconsolable, taking a special truck with people who then collected parts of Gareth for a quick cook-off. It was deemed that he should also recluse himself from the rest of the proceedings. He sniffed, nodded, then wandered off with the flashkits, all strumming or blowing into instruments as they went. Kronan was relieved, if truth be told, for Melton was deeply tedious, and Kronan had absolutely no understanding of how such a high-strung nitwit could wrestle control of the flashkits. But Melton had, so Kronan would continue to use him, and just cross his fingers that Melton was one of the first to buy the farm when they finally arrived at their destination. The bundle, to end all bundles. Kronan would have put in a word with the big guy, Mork, to nudge the probabilities, but he had not the tongue for it, so he did not. And things were now getting more tense in the behind-the-curtains region, for some of the pets were not as hopeful in the next event, but more than this. Some of them had this deranged concept that there was something deeply off going on, and that its genesis was the cute and happy wee squig owned by Madnot Krunkelstein. The fulcrum of all this seemed to be Erebus. Now that's not me mispronouncing Erebus. That is a totally different bag of excrement altogether. And so it was that the last event began, the first being fightiness. Now to be clear, that did not mean effectiveness, but fightiness. For even a wee snot can be lauded for their fighting spirit, even though they are almost universally of less use in a scrap than a party-sized bottle of lube. And the list of contestants was thinned out quite nicely. For Flynn had died with Gareth, Patsy had wandered off, which was a real shame, as she would have done amazingly in this trial. And of course, Laserbeak had gone with Grinner. The fighting was about to begin, and Kronan could not wait. Alas, he had to, for this intermission was dragged out on purpose. Many wished to indulge in a flutter on this event more than any other, and the bets were being given and received in their handfuls. Teeth like a river exchanged hands before the get-go. Needless to say that quite a few brawls were coaxed into being by Orkies attempting to haggle the odds up or down on their favourite pet. A good time was had by all. Now the smart money was on Munchington III, a few bet on Rocky, but not many really. Yet there was now a growing betting block appearing from the Bad Moons, and they were all universally betting on Erebus. Some helpfully even admitted that they would be sharing their cut with Krunkelstein, but who knew why? Admiration, one would presume. Yet the betting now became very one-sided, and more of the bet holders were sweating as they watched the block put more and more teeth into the venture. And so it was that Kronan had a quick break back at his quarters. I mean, the bosses would need to say goodbye, good luck to their prized pets, for there were never any guarantees in a combat scenario, and the betting and clearing of the sands were also taking time, especially as he had to do all of this on sheep, and most sheep were not known for their fresh sands repositories. But that was not his concern, it was for the masses. of which Kronan adored, of course, being the eminently perfectly principled leader of his people. Yet, he could not burden himself with everything, and it would be unfair if he did. For how could all the other orcs contribute to the greater weal of the Waaagh, if not for getting stuck in? And that was not just for the battlefield either, although this was, of course, the ultimate expression of getting stuck in, and what all the other forms were attempting to garner really. But in any case, Kronan now ate a bit, farted a lot, then picked out some heavy objects, and lay down to bench press some reps while he relaxed. He found himself looking at his grot mobile again, and this had the tragic side effect of opening himself up to ideas. Hence on rep 225, he put down his thong and hooked a few of the grots to take away their weapons, but then hit a few more buttons, and extra protection came out for the disarmed makeshift sheep, being grots of course. And he then got down and snapped off a few thousand reps more and disappeared into the void of space in his mind's eye. He looked at the harder but unable to attack sheep grots, and the other grots burnt and derided them at first, for they could not fire back, so the bravery of the still armed grots went skyward. But as time went on, and he was nearing completion of his circuit, he watched more carefully still, as things began to shift. The armed grots were now getting increasingly angry, nay, enraged even, at the lack of effect of their burners, and those grots who were inside the heavy armour were apathetic at first, but now were very derisive to their ineffectually armed enemies, and the burner sheep grots would lean and rebalance in precarious ways just to get a better or different angle on their seemingly impervious enemies. They took more risks due to being so brassed off. Kronan then flicked another switch and took out his hook again, but this time returning burners to the armoured grots. But where the armed grots could not see, and when the armoured grots came within range, their enemies were practically falling out of their sheep to get to burn the armoured ones. Hence, they could not scramble back inside cover when the armoured ones then gave off a huge cheer and opened up, incinerating whole swathes of them. Kronan saw the truth of the matter, the hidden message the Mork was sending him, via the motion of his holy grots. Fully relaxed after his workout, and not even thinking to call for Phyllis, as he only had a few more moments, he dipped into the roster of Kazi squadrons. He was not looking for any name or rank in particular, and scrolled down just to gain a general ballpark, whatever that was, of the amount the Daka and the Mystery of Truth had managed to recruit. And he was both impressed and proud to see the list scroll on and on. The Kazi squadrons, most feared and honoured of all of the flyboys. None had even a snot's chance in a kin stronghold of getting out alive against the winds of Waaagh in an open dogfight, but that was not their purpose. It was not their calling. For the Kazi, as Kronan had dubbed them, were the most ardent of his followers. Like burning stars, they would shine for a moment only, then be remembered for all time. Well, this was intensely unlikely, considering the level of even object permanency in the Orc Waaagh, but it sounded good to the youths. The first recruits Kronan had addressed personally. Subsequent cohorts would be shown the vid recording, of course, and in that first intake he outlined their task, their sacred duty. For the enemy might sometimes be well-armed and be supported by their own gods of Waaagh, and in those moments when the dung had hit the fan and they were all without a paddle, this was when the fleet would need the Kazi. Their leader and first orc to be sworn in was Kami, thus were the Kazi named after him also, but this would probably slide soon enough. Anywho, the Kazi were trained to avoid ducker fire and evade fighter patrols, or even just form a spear tip with their mass numbers to get to the target. Then, when within range, the Kazi would perform the sacred Edbutt with their fighters, and they would shine like a star for all time in the memory of the Waaagh, or something like that. Kronan and Smashoven now had full wings of the Kazi, and they would not be used as many would. No. For many had thought that the Kazi would be sent out early to mess up the enemy by getting in some fast first licks. But Kronan was the cunning one. He knew their best uses. Oh, yes, he did. They were holy warriors of Waaagh. They would not be thrown away on a whim. Oh no, they would not. And so it was that Kronan rejoined the makeshift arena, and off proceedings trotted again. It seemed that random lots had not been given for the first round, but a sort of weight category arrangement, at least for the first round. There were some mismatches, to be certain. One that did surprise all with its speed was the very one-sided battle between the Hunger, Grandmaster Tartan's bowl of rippyfish, and the vampire squig. All laughed at Tartan as he sat there stiff-backed as Vlad von Vroomstein stalked over to the bowl. All held their breath, ready to bark out with their laughter when he did it, when Vlad would just kick over the bowl and stamp on the rippyfish. Alas, at the last moment, Vlad von Vroomstein lowered his raised leg and placed it on the ground. His eyes flashed a dark green, and then he placed his face into the bowl in some vacuous attempt to eat the rippyfish. But he had come into their domain, so they bit his face off in less than 3 seconds, the dead vampire squig falling back, toothless and faceless, as the rippyfish had removed everything he had placed in the water. Grandmaster Tartan simply sniffed and looked even more haughty, as his bowl of fish was the clear winner. The battle between Squawk von Smashhoven and Rocky was predictably short as well, as the Squighawk dove on Rocky, gripped him, and lifted him into the air, and then dropped him from a great height. And Appledon's face dropped like a Disney stock portfolio, but he merely grumbled as he went off to take out his ire on his boys. A charmer, eh? The moment Colin and Mr. Drofo heard the alarm gong, they both moved. Colin the Stink drew his blowpipe to his lips and inflated his lungs, only to find that they had both collapsed. Across from him, the calm runtling, Mr. Drofo, holstered his stub pistols and turned his back on him. The Stink fell dead before Mr. Drofo had left the arena. Now that Laserbeak had withdrawn, Gareth was slain, Patsy had gone ambulabout, and Flynn had self-deleted. There was no suitable opponent to Erebus. But the top billing was the most fun, though, and this had to be Robo-Grot versus Munchington III. For the Robo-Grot pet of Isaac Newton, Roland was now decked out in a shiny new set of killer can armor. At first, Roland had the better of the engagement as he fired his Grotzuka and glanced Munchington, taking off one of his tiny vestigial arms. But that was for about 2.5 seconds, as a Squigosaur charged him. Roland stood his ground and attempted to grab Munchington's lower jaw with his claw. His intent was to clamp down and tear it off. Yet Munchington III was a tiny bit swifter, and he enveloped the whole claw arm in his maw and bit it off. Oils and fluids spurted from the stump of the can, and Munchington then pushed it over, its wee legs treading the air trying to gain purchase on the ground. But the Squigosaur gave no quarter, and bit into the body multiple times. Even as towels were being repeatedly thrown in by Isaac Newton, it did not end until Munchington had found Roland inside the can, and then done what he does best. Now Tartan and Smashhoven felt that their pets had done all they could in this one, and would accept whatever results went forward. It wasn't that they didn't want to see a slaughter, it was just that it would take away from the main event. Squawk and the Hunger were clearly outmatched, and had cost quite a bit of teeth and effort to gain, let alone the time to train and maintain them, sunk cost and all that. And so it was that there were only 3 in the last round: Munchington, Mr. Drofo, and Erebus. So a 3-way was to be the decider. No cover, no hiding spots. This looked bad for all involved. For Mr. Drofo was not only sporting his twin auto pistols, but also a very nasty sniping rifle. He might get off one shot before things went sideways, so he meant it to count. And this huge bastard of a rifle on him was about the size a normal Humie would carry. Yet Mr. Drofo seemed to know what he was about, and he hefted it with ease. Munchington III scratched at the floor, circling and huffed and puffed, preparing to get at them in an instant. But who would he go for? His target was likely to die, giving the third person the chance to live. Or so it seemed, if that third person could slay Munchington. Big if. And there was Erebus, now looking wide-eyed and cute, harmlessly wandering about, naive at the crowds and spectacle. Yet, when its back was turned to the other contestants, and only the crowd could see its face, it grinned a vicious grin. And the chant began again. Pluck, Erebus! Pluck, Erebus! Or something like that. But Madnut did not seem even slightly concerned that his pet, and by extension he himself, was being derided by the crowds. Not just in the arena either, but across the entire fleet this chant came stronger and stronger. Yet somehow it seemed to power the horrific ball of evil. As the bong was hit, signalling the commencement of the battle, Erebus simply disappeared. Munchington had already taken a few paces towards Erebus, but skidded and realigned himself to Mr. Drofo, as he simply couldn't see Erebus. And Drofo sighted up his rifle and breathed out. His finger caressed the trigger, and the bullet shot out towards a squigosaur. It flew straight and true, aimed directly between the thing's eyes. Perhaps it would have slayed Lord Munchington III, if it had connected. But a strange green field appeared around the head of the squigosaur, and the bullet's force was sapped from it so much that it just bounced off the skin of Munchington. A gasp came from the crowd, and then shouts of hatred and infamy. Pluck, pluck, Erebus was chanted even louder, as Munchington III tore towards Mr. Drofo. The small runtling dropped his rifle and hauled out his 6-shooters. Both blasted out every last round in 2 seconds, but their power was not enough. They pierced the skin, but they did not cripple Munchington, and he came in and bit Mr. Drofo in half. Well, one half was everything but his feet, and the other half was said hairy feet. But half, I guess, is right. Well, thirds, but that implies even more equality in the 3 places, does it not? In any case, Mr. Drofo was well and truly had passed on. Erebus then unveiled himself, floating off the ground, cackling, as he looked down on the wounded Munchington. And, to the surprise of all, the squigosaur wasted not a millisecond as he dived up towards the green energy-wreathed squig. Erebus unleashed a huge column of green fire that struck down at Munchington, burning his flesh, melting his eyes, yet not stopping him. At the last nanosecond, Erebus was on the verge of being swallowed whole by the extended jaws of Munchington. The next nanosecond, he was behind him. He had moved as the avatar of Teeth had. He teleported. Erebus fired more, but Munchington III was dying even as he fell to the ground. And Erebus continued on and on, until there was nothing left of Munchington. He was naught but a shadow on the sands. Erebus had won his match, the title, and the entire contest. A new horror had been unleashed on the Waaagh, and the dark machinations and reign of Erebus had begun. Would that he was not slain by Tiddles there and then, for it looked intensely like the avatar of Teeth would do what so many wanted to be done. Yet, as Tiddles rose to meet the challenge of this upstart turd, Kronan gave him a quick buffet and instructed him to sit. Against his better judgment, Tiddles complied. Not that he had any better judgment, mind you. He's a squig, after all. Yet he obeyed his lord. And Kronan awarded the victory to Madnut Krunkelstein and his pet, Erebus, the weird squig. A whole day killed, as the bosses were now all lifted in spirit by a massive feast put on by the Cunning One. They had raised his spirits, staved off boredom for him, as he had done before for so many others. The giver had become the receiver, and Kronan was proud of the entire day, endlessly regaling all around him with his most favoured moments and pets. And what a good day was had by all. Now, on to the events of high adventure. Now, on to the final battle with Yane's Blonde, the Smeldar pirate prince. And so it was that the envelopment went apace, and the Smeldar were forced back time and time again. Rarely did they stand to fight, even for a few hours. They ceded ground again and again over the next days, until, finally, they were running out of options, as they were running out of space. You see, Kronan had thought of everything. And the Smeldar, they were actually astonishingly killy, yet they could not take a hit. Even the waif units, really. They were what the Humies would call a glass crayon, or something like that. Kronan was as certain about this as he could possibly be, well, for a greenskin totally guessing the motivations of a much smarter species. So, he checked as best he could. He asked the freebooter, Grinner, to join him for dinner. Oh, the backstabber was mightily skittish all evening, remembering his time on the spit, and suspecting that his quick retreat from the pet competition might have gained him further brown points with the cunning one. Not brownie points, mind you, for those were generally considered to be quite nice. I mean, who doesn't like a brownie? Yet brown points referred more to the colour of one's trousers when meeting with Kronan. Not that Grinner had shared that with anyone but...
"Ah, hand me my brown trousers,"
squawked Laserbeak, who then shuffled along his perch to be as far away from Kronan as possible. Yet the meeting went well, for Kronan got to the point and asked Grinner about freebooters and corsairs and what they all wanted. He explained that to fight a thing, to defeat a thing, one must understand that thing. A tiny bit at least, optimally, you know. And in one word, Grinner confirmed Kronan's suspicions. Oh, he expounded further, but it was all personal preferences from that point on, really. Grinner was not stupid for an orc, but that wasn't saying much. The competition being as staunch as village idiot candidacy in a hamlet of 3 people, the other 2 being doctorate holders in multiple academically esoteric disciplines. But the answer was simple. Booty. It all came down to booty. And why would it not? For did the Smeldar not have extra ears or second noses? Of course they did. Hence, booty in all its forms was their direst weakness. An Achilles heel that was in fact widespread knowledge across the Miliway galaxy, according to his data slate. Perfect, thought Kronan. He had them now. Their measure, their metal, and now their weakness was his also. Well, apart from their allergy to a good straight scrap, of course. These buggers didn't like it up 'em. Oh no, they did not. Hence Kronan knew that Yane's Blonde would stand for his treasure trove, or try to flee. But he couldn't. If he did that, he would be toppled as leader and replaced as swiftly as if Kronan himself had walked away from a good scrap. For the Smeldar were hoity-toity, and so full of themselves that to be defeated by an orc was out of the question. And Kronan knew this too. He had one chance at this, just a one. They would never fall for it again, so he made the most of it. He used more than 2 plans. He used so many, they would make me seem like a liar to list the overlapping plots and schemes, feigns and thrusts. He was, indeed, the cunning one. For he had watched the grots, as we have heard. He could feel the Smeldar's anger, their frustration, and he would use it. Yes, he would. At last, Kronan sent out one solitary sheep to the most likely position Kronan had estimated the enemy had their main station. He had asked Krunkelstein to invoke the toenail of Mork and to strive for that place. But Krunkelstein could not. The Smeldar were blocking him, and if that was true, it was definitely the central station that he needed. The sheep appeared out of the burp and transmitted a single message on repeat. The orcs claimed the right of parley. It then gave a place and a date 2 days hence, and pandemonium broke out in the hearts of the Corsairs. Could there be a way out? Holy Isha, blessed mother, was this orc giving them an exit? But then the arrogance flared. What if the enemy was Could they trust the word of a greenskin? The semi-sentient, hateful, barbaric scum that the Smeldar had fought since the stars first shone, some said. They were animals, surely. No, they were a bacteria, and the Eldar were the panacea. Yain's blood had seen endless wars without count, and he knew how to deal with them. Cut off the head, and the body dies. Most often with greenskins, by tearing itself apart and floating into obscurity. Small bands of raiders, all that remained, a nuisance, not a threat. Yes, decided the Smeldar Admiral, he would come, but he would come to end the matter. They were only orcs. And so it was that the two fleets met. One of the last pockets Kronan's fleets had yet surrounded, and not yet destroyed. For the Smeldar could jump away to a sub-dimension of the burp called the Web Bay. But they always needed resources. They left their holdings behind every time they fled. And they could not live in the Web Bay forever. Pride was the killer, though. They could not believe the luck of the greenskins. It almost looked like a full envelopment, but it could not be. It was random dumb luck and the sheer numbers of the orcs. Nothing more. The Smeldar fleet massed for the single throw of the dice. Those who had haunted and hunted these stars for centuries prepared their last to retain them, to retake them. Kronan and Grandmouth Tartan had everything worked out, and it began. Tearing a hole into the burp, Kronan's envoy fleet translated back into real space. They were met by contacts like they had not witnessed in all of the war so far. Yain's blood had scores of ships of the line out there, many escorts and cutters, entire shoals of fighters, and the Orky bridge crew grinned to each other as the fleet came up on their displays. Win or lose, this was going to be epic. Kronan stood on the bridge of the Squealing Piggy, with Grinner to backstabber, a battle sheep he'd bought, would you believe. But Kronan did record the booty gained by taking over an entire world. He'd split it generously, and Grinner had invested well. Top of the range, the Squealing Piggy was fast and nimble for its size. Hard ramming segments at the fore, and lots of darker bristling in near every direction. Grinner knew the way to fight as a raider. Overwhelm and escape. Yet, it was the best sheep for them both to be on, as it was going to lead the battle. It had been augmented by both Allbot Eye Sting and Step-on Squawking. It had some juice all right, but also some of the most potent forward shielding and armour that Orkydom could provide. And the backstabber now had a fixed grin so wide it was hard to see how he maintained it without pinning his face in place, which, on closer inspection, Grinner may well have done. But in any case, he had his powerful hat with him. This was it. The end game. Or perhaps a weird new beginning. The Smeldar fleet seemed to pause, to make sure that the meagre fleet of the greenskins was all the fools had brought. Then, with real verve, they fired up and swept towards the envoy fleet. They outnumbered the orcs 3-1. It would be swift, or at least it would, had this been entirely the case. As the Eldar committed their fighter wings to the assault, they received a shock of their own. Their Auspex devices flared as they saw the countless rips into the void that tore out at every edge of the system. They were surrounded, not in a circle, but in a full globe. Near everywhere they looked, there was no breach, no gap. There were Orky sheeps everywhere. And the Smeldar knew that they were doomed. They had two choices now, as usual. Hold firm and take out the big boss, or flee and never return to this region of space ever again. But they were Smeldar from their boots to their buttons. They would fight, and Kronan respected that. Then the weakness was discovered, and the Smeldar sheeps moved as one. Half of their fleet slipped towards Kronan. Their other half went towards the weak point, the gap in the ring. From there, the Smeldar could clear the enveloping lines and then roll them up annihilating the orky Waaagh sheeps piecemeal, unless the greenskins withdrew in good order and regained a formation. But these were orcs. Unlike certain sects, withdrawal was not their way, nor was good order. The existence of both fleets now hung on a razor's edge. Kronan's order was simple. Advance. Full speed ahead. Grinner was still nominally the captain of the sheep, so he gave the orders to the crew. The entire envoy force was now aimed directly at the flagship of Yane's Blonde, the smiling assassin. Kronan nudged Grinner, who then undid a flap in his hat, and a lambent green light came out, showing the battle in perfect 3D. And it began to plot a course which altered every 3 seconds. But there was that pathway shown in bright green light. Grinner bellowed the exact terms and altitudes and headings, and the helm of St. Hungo guided the squealing piggy through danger to its destination. Banks of fire, missile swarms, lance batteries, long-range Eldar lasers, all were barely avoided. Not all, but most. And that which struck the piggy was not enough to shatter its void shields. A few, but never all, and they cycled back up again swiftly. The sheeps around the piggy were not only eviscerated with just the fire that was aimed at the battle sheep, but the sheeps around the piggy were often eviscerated from the fire that was aimed at the battle sheep. Escorts and kill cruisers burst like ripe fruit hit by a baseball bat in a circle around the piggy. But she always managed to slip through by the skin of her trotters. And the envoy fleet was being torn apart by the Smeldar fighter wings that now danced amongst them unopposed. The winds of Waaagh were elsewhere, you see. Yet, when they had come into knife-fighting range of the outer echelons of the Smeldar fleet, Kronan's sheeps opened their bays and released their response. Split-purpose Kazi elite wings came zooming out into the void, but they did not dogfight their opposite numbers. They rushed towards the enemy capital sheeps in front of them. But they had been fired out at such short range that the Smeldar could not avoid them. At first, they did not even try, assuming that the Kazi would fly around their large assets and be snuffed out one by the Smeldar fighter aces. Yet, when the first one slammed into the hulls, fins and sails of the Eldar fleet, the horror dawned on them. The Kazi were split purpose, as stated, meaning that one half of their number would escort the main thrust. They would sweep out to drag away missiles or confuse or negate chasing enemy fighters. The other central half got the job done and slammed into the most vital positions of the Eldar sheeps. Well, the ones most decorated, spindly or dramatically underlit was more accurate, but this proved more effective than the Smeldar had suspected possible. And the piggy ploughed into the heart of the Smeldar formation, dodging the scrap and explosions now erupting all around it, as the Kazi formed a pathway, and the sheeps behind the piggy launched everything they had to clear the way further. The smiling assassin was repelling a wedge of the Kazi, when frantic fire from not only its point defense, its fighter screens also, but even the main weapons were directed at these fanatical ramming craft. The Smeldar were used to orc ram sheeps, but not this small. The carnage of burning and blasted sheep rotating in space. The firepower between the smiling assassin and the piggy made it impossible to see what was happening. Hence, the squealing piggy slammed through one last wrecked Smeldar cruiser, and it was upon the flagship of the Smeldar. Unloading at near point-blank range, the piggy raked fire across the assassin, collapsing every void shield one after another. Coming about as fast as they could, the smiling assassin now concentrated all of her own fire on the piggy in response. The sheer skill and accuracy of the Smeldar elite craft was breathtaking, even to Kronan. He nodded sagely as he saw the fightiness on display. And in seconds, both sheep were open to the void, armor all that was left to protect them as they traded broadsides. Yet, now Kronan made haste for the bays, and he charged into the waiting boarding pods. Isaac Newton's knockoffs were not as fancy or simple as their Adipi Arse ones, nor as reliable, safe nor protected, yet they were plentiful. Kronan had over 100 of the Black Legion with him in a score of pods, and off they went. Across the system, The second fleet of the Smeldar was gunning for the gap with everything they had. Yet, just as they could taste their breakout and subsequent Waaagh, the horror got worse. For a huge rent in the burp opened, and out blurted the Orcs of Omen. Not a single escort or support vessel. She did not need it. And with that one move, the Orcs had plugged the gap. The breakout Smeldar fleet slowed, indecision writ large in its lack of certainty. On the bridge of many a Smeldar sheep, the same set of events occurred. They looked at the numbers. They looked at the positioning. With the huge hole plugged by the Orcs of Omen, they were surrounded, and every hour would bring more Orcs into range, by far faster and with cohesion. They would be drowned in green-skinned sheep. And so it was, that many a cat-pain of the Smeldar did order their sheep to jump into the web bay. Alas for the Smeldar, as I have said, Kronan had thought of everything. For on many of the capital sheeps of the Waaagh, there were literally hundreds of weird boys harnessing the power of the Waaagh. And with said power, they chanted louder and louder, echoing their screams and bellows through the burp. Which, when one of the Smeldar attempted to contact the burp and open the field, turned out to be a scream so loud that it deafened them. It did not make it impossible to enter the web bay, but it made it difficult. And the delay meant that many sheeps now saw that not all could jump away, which slowed down the attempted exodus. Many of these sheep were filled with corsair scum of the worst kind, but they were not Dork Smeldar, so they would fight and die with their brothers and sisters. And the damage they would inflict on the Orcs would never be forgotten. Or at least this is what they told themselves. And so it was that Kronan's pod slammed home in a very fortuitous position, as one would hope for the Blessed One, Kronan, most loved by Morg. The decks of the smiling assassin were tall and white, glistening, and a bit annoying really, because they made looking about almost a pain after staring into the void for so long, and though the walls were near acoustic perfection, which really helped with the feel and thunder of Dukkha, it also meant that even the slightest fart or creaky boot would sound much like someone eating crisps or chips, as the colonials say, about 2 millimeters away from your ear. Deeply annoying. But that was the only negative that any would write up in their review on wheretoffight.com. Looking on the sunny side, though, the light really did help with the recordings from the vidgrots in each mob of Kronan's Khan, Black Legion. Needless to say, the Smeldar were having a spot of difficulty, resisting rampaging mobs of mega-armoured knobs. Oh, some were sizzled by melter weapons, and a few nailed by void grenades, but these were never popular to be used on a sheep. But needs must when the squig-off charges, though, as Kronan still wanted everyone to say. But alas, they would not. But with a few small segments of hardened resistance aside, the Orcs were making good time to their designated zones. Each was to head to one or other place that would be so important to their Smeldar that they could not do anything but defend it. Perhaps the choice of top of the ship and following signs that may look like barbers or saunas, as it was where the fops would be gathered, may not have been as astute as perhaps Kronan had wanted, but Apeldoorn had been left with the instructions for the teams. Hence, much carnage was wrought across the sheep. But then, the randomness of the rampages of the greenskin was so bemusing to the logical Smeldar that it was probably more effective in its goal, which was pure, unadulterated distraction. For Kronan led Apeldoorn and a score of the Legion toward the bridge. To be fair, which is always an admirable facility or trait in any good chronicler, it must be said that the Smeldar were not the cosmic weeds and dandies that Kronan had always suspected and the Humis had always claimed. They were more than just nippy and accurate. They had a real zeal for all of this, a spite that was more than laudable in the eyes of the Cunning One. For each of their movements was planned out in advance, their minds subtle and movements economical. And Kronan was staggered to have this feeling. But then, he had opened the door to that already when he had formed his master plan. But now was not the time for that. Now was a time to crush his enemies, see them driven before him, and hear the lamentation of their big-eared ones. The orcs fought their way to the very doors. Oh, the Smeldar had been tough, but they were no match for the Black Legion, especially not Apeldoorn and Kronan. And it was Kronan himself who melted off the doors of the Smeldar bridge. He chucked the heavy melter back to the orc next to him and walked into the bridge. And there he stood, Yanes Blonde, the Smeldar pirate prince. He was tall, even for one of the pointies, and he was regal as a hawk. No firepower came towards the Legion, nor Kronan, as the Smeldar now drew their power weapons and lit them up with their mines, ghostly sci-fire rippling along their length. Before the prince stood a shadowy warrior, in figure-hugging, perfectly sculpted plates of armour. He had one large two-handed clave and a helm that was tall and grim. Nog Crusher, who was Apeldoorn, gave out a war cry and pounded forward. He brought his mighty power claw down towards the Smeldar warrior, but he was not there. Kronan saw it all. Apeldoorn missed a lot, for he did not see the Smeldar warrior sidestep. He did not see him wheel around his back. And he certainly did not see the two-handed clave which swept over his shoulders and across his neck. Apeldoorn's head bounced onto the ground, and then his mega-armoured body fell forward, pretty much crushing it. Kronan, for himself, smirked, and gave a tiny nod of his head to the Smeldar assassin. For surely this was not a crafty world Smeldar. Kronan took a few paces, and took up his own stance. The Smeldar darted forward with an incredibly direct and final blow to the centre of Kronan's noggin. Kronan, being up for it, blocked the clave on his chopper and went to work. The two of them exchanging strike after strike. If Kronan had tried this a few years ago, he would be a pile of slices on the floor. If he had tried this even 6 months ago, he would fallen into any of a dozen traps laid by the duelist and lost his head as Apeldoorn had. Yet now, he was not just a student of cunning. He was the master. And Kronan feigned, overbalancing and slipping to one knee. The Smeldar was on him in a flash, only for Kronan to continue the movement and roll forward himself. The Smeldar had committed to the heaviest swing of their combat, and had left him open for a split second. Kronan did not need a written invitation, as he simply aimed a snap kick at the lithe leg, and practically took it off the Smeldar. The knee shattered like an ice statue hit by a Boeing 747. His upper and lower body muscles went into spasm as the bones pushed through them. The Smeldar did not whelp, yelp, or scream, but he did not have the speed to evade the downward swing of Kronan's power claw, and the Smeldar lost its life instantly. While the Black Legion continued with the rest of the crew, Yanes Blonde walked down the stairs one by one, gliding slowly down to stand before Kronan. But Kronan could see it in his eyes. The prince had not given in. Still, despite that he could not see a way out from either this duel or this predicament for his entire fleet, yet still, he had not given in to despair. And Kronan wanted to match him blade to blade, to dominate him utterly and take his scalp, or anything else he wanted, really. But this was not his plan. For now, Kronan lowered his blade. He opened a palm to the prince, a gesture that clearly stated, "Wait." Yanes Blonde raised an eyebrow and looked on, as Kronan then reached behind himself and took out an armoured box. He opened it, and then passed the contents to the Smeldar. He reached out with his hand, and in it was a data slate. Yanes Blonde narrowed his eyes, but then he stretched out his dainty hand and snatched the data slate from Kronan. And he looked at it. And there, in black and white, in Gothic and in gobbledygook, of course, was a message. It was very structured, set out meticulously, and in very plain but very direct wording. And Yanes Blonde now furrowed his eyebrows and barked out in Eldar the one word. His men instantly backed off, and, to the shock of every Smeldar there. The orcs did not follow them. They simply let them disengage at a single snap of Kronan's fingers. And so it was that Kronan's message was incredibly simple. For he had thought so hard before. The Corsairs were freebooters. They were pirates. They wanted one thing above all others. Well, for the Smeldar and Humies, there was probably a separate priority of staying alive. But this was unfathomable to the Greenskins, as they had no concept of fearing death. It was simply a part of life. Yet, as we have heard, all pirates, of every stripe, colour or creed, love one thing above all others: booty. And that is what James Blonde had been offered in a river. The missive was so excruciatingly simple, yet so unprecedented, that it blew the mind of the ancient Smeldar admiral straight out of the back of his breeches. He stood agog as he read the simple missive. You join our Waaagh. We do not shoot you. You fight as you want. You get half of the booty, and you get first dibs. Or option 2, it read simply, we all die. James Blonde looked at Kronan quizzically, as if to say, is this for real? When the cunning one lowered his weapons further and looked Blonde deep in the eye and winked, then nodded, the Smeldar blinked a few times. James Blonde then shrugged, sheathed his sword, and pulled off his glove. He placed his thumb over the data slate, and it blinked green. He then passed it back to Kronan, who did the same. The data slate then bleeped and stated in Gothic, agreement reached. Contract signed by all parties. The contract begins immediately. And across the fleet, the order was given by both Kronan and by James Blonde to cease firing. To be continued.